Alright guys, how's it going? Today's a special day for the channel as I'm reviewing my first ever Nvidia graphics card. My first real review, that is, of an Nvidia graphics card. And that card is the MSI GTX 1080 Ti Gaming X. Looking at the card specifications, it of course has 11GB of memory, the same as every other GTX 1080 Ti, and the Gaming X has 3 different clock speeds managed by software. For the purposes of this review, I will simply be using gaming mode. As usual, it's the out-of-the-box setup. So that's 1656MHz boost clock and a 1544MHz base clock. As you'll see here though, the actual clock speed of the card goes well above those numbers. A memory clock of 11,016MHz and a recommended power supply of around 600 watts. The card dimensions 290 by 140 by 51mm. Make sure you check that before buying. Looking at the connectors, you have 2 HDMI, 2 DisplayPort and 1 DVI-D. One of the more notable features is the twin Frozer cooling system, which allows for completely silent operation below 60 degrees. After 60 degrees, the fans start spinning up, but at no point during my testing did I feel the fans were loud or annoying. As you can see here, it's got a very beefy heatsink on it, and this combined with the Torx fans clearly gives it a quality cooling solution. The card of course also comes with a solid metal backplate. MSI claims the 1080 Ti Gaming X is the ultimate gaming graphics card, with design and performance in a class of its own. So let's get on with the review and see if there is any merits to their claims. Now a quick note on the test setup today. I'm using an i7 7700K at stock speeds with 16GB of G.Skill Trident Z DDR4 memory and a Corsair 750W RMX power supply. Competing against MSI's 1080 Ti Gaming X today is AMD's fastest graphics card, their RX Vega Liquid Edition, which has a maximum boost clock of 1750MHz and comes with HBM2 memory. For recording the in-game gameplay, I am of course using Shadowplay with the 1080 Ti while using Relive on Vega. One interesting point of note though is that I am using a FreeSync monitor here, so it could be interesting to see if that makes a difference. And in order to do so, let's go on with the benchmarks. Right, so first up is Doom, an old favourite of mine at 4K resolution, and MSI's 1080 Ti Gaming X scores 109.6 frames per second compared to Vega's 85.8, a difference of 27.7%. Something worth noting is that Shadowplay has a major performance impact in this game, with a very large drop of 12% while recording. Unfortunately, I couldn't test this with Vega, as Relive will not record the game. So the 1080 Ti is off to a very good start. Right, so next up is another old favourite of mine, Fallout 4. In order to remove the CPU bottleneck, this is only being tested at 4K resolution. Testing out a new benchmark sequence here, and once we cross over the bridge, we can see that the MSI 1080 Ti Gaming X is a very long way ahead indeed, with Vega struggling to maintain even 60 frames per second. Also of note here is the quality of the recording, with Shadowplay apparently being of higher quality, at least in terms of reproducing colours. I'm not entirely sure if you'll be able to see this on YouTube, but the colours appear to be a bit richer on the left hand side. Interesting again though that there was quite a large performance penalty while running Shadowplay compared to Relive. Overall though, it's another strong result for Nvidia, with the 1080 Ti averaging 83 frames per second compared to Vega's 61.7 frames per second, and that is a difference of 34.5%. Right, so moving on to the Assassin Simulator Hitman. Really good looking game this one, with plenty going on the screen. Again tested at 4K resolution, and again another good win for the MSI 1080 Ti, averaging 80.1 frames per second compared to 63.8 frames per second of Vega. That's a difference of 25.5%, and in actual fact this is Vega's best result today. I did find this one quite interesting though, as there was no discernible difference in the quality of the gameplay, even with quite a large lead here for the MSI 1080 Ti. And I have attributed this to the FreeSync monitor. So long as Vega can stay above 60 frames per second, there's very little difference in the quality of the gameplay. But again, we're looking at another hefty victory for the 1080 Ti. Right, so next up is the newest addition to my benchmarking suite, Mass Effect Andromeda. Now there's been a lot said about this game, the bad acting and the wooden animations, but the environments are actually very nice. And I actually find the gameplay to be somewhat decent. Looking at the 4K performance, however, and it's somewhere between poor and terrible, with the 1080 Ti only managing 51.5 frames per second on average. That is still way ahead of Vega though, which languishes on only 36.3 frames per second. That is a massive gap of 41.9%, and the 1080 Ti's best result today. Neither experience is what I would call very good, but not even FreeSync can save Vega this time, and in actual fact, the game sometimes drops below 35 frames per second, which is the lower FreeSync limit of this monitor. Moving on to 1440p results, and the 1080 Ti scores 94 frames per second compared to 66.6 frames per second of Vega. Once again, a massive difference of 41%, but once again, the gameplay felt very similar, with no obvious differences. And again, this seems to be the case when Vega can maintain a minimum of 60 frames per second, along with the FreeSync monitor. Overall though, it's a crushing victory for the 1080 Ti Gaming X. Next on the list is Prey, one of my favourite games of the year so far. Starting off with 4K resolution, and the 1080 Ti scores 63.6 frames per second compared to 49.5 frames per second of Vega. This was an interesting one because the 1080 Ti was above 60 frames per second average, while Vega was below. And it was interesting to see that while FreeSync does help to smooth out the worst of it, it does feel just that little bit better on the 1080 Ti. It is better to be above 60 frames per second without adaptive sync rather than be below 50 frames per second with FreeSync, but it's actually closer than I was expecting, even though the 1080 Ti is 28.5% ahead here at 4K. Moving on to the 1440p results, and the 1080 Ti Gaming X averages 126.4 frames per second compared to Vega's 94.1, and even though that's a difference of 34.3%, the gameplay experience on both was pretty much identical. No great surprises by this stage though, it's another very good win for the 1080 Ti. Moving on to another favourite game of mine, Rise of the Tomb Raider, although I must say I did prefer the 2013 reboot compared to the latest version. Another interesting result here, very similar to what we saw in Prey at 4K. Nearly identical scores in fact, with the 1080 Ti scoring 63.8 frames per second compared to 49.6 frames per second on Vega, a difference of 28.6%. Once again, the experience was very similar. There's not an awful lot in it, but I would take over 60 frames per second compared to under 50 and FreeSync. The 1080 Ti experience was just that little bit better at 4K. Now moving on to 1440p, and another different scene here, where the 1080 Ti scored 84.3 frames per second compared to 61.9 frames per second of Vega, giving a gap of 36.2%. Again, a very similar experience in both. In this case though, I would have to say that I did feel that the 1080 Ti experience was just a little bit better, and I'm not sure if that's because at some points of the benchmark, Vega did drop below 60 frames per second. And another very similar result overall. It's pretty clear by now that the Gaming X is around 30% faster than Vega on average. So the final game benchmark today is The Witcher 3, starting off at 4K, and we've got an almost identical result to Rise of the Tomb Raider and Prey once again. The 1080 Ti scores 63.5 frames per second compared to 48.7 frames per second of Vega. Witcher 3 is a bit of a strange game I find. For me, the gameplay does not feel smooth, certainly not compared to the other games like Prey and Rise of the Tomb Raider, even though the frame rate is very similar in all three cases. The Witcher 3 experience does not feel that smooth. In this case, I would have to say that the 1080 Ti did feel that little bit better, but not an awful lot in it. Moving on to 1440p, and the 1080 Ti scores 110.1 frames per second compared to 84.6 frames per second of Vega. Now normally for me 110 frames per second would feel very smooth, but in this case I wasn't really feeling it. But it was interesting that I did feel that once again, even though Vega was above 60 frames per second by quite a distance, it just felt that little bit better on the 1080 Ti, although again it didn't feel particularly good in either case. I don't know if it's just The Witcher 3 or something else, but I've always felt this about this game. But anyway, overall it's another 30% victory for the MSI 1080 Ti Gaming X. And that wraps up the benchmarks. Now I spent a little bit of time overclocking, nothing too serious, no increases in voltages or anything like that. By ramping the power limit up to 117% of maximum, I was able to get a stable plus 100 on the core and plus 250 on the memory. So this meant that the card was more often than not holding over 2 GHz, and I'm sure you'll get even more out of that with higher voltages. Running through the Witcher 3 benchmark at 4K, and the card was now capable of 66.5 frames per second, or an increase of 4.7% over the stock speed. Right, so to summarise my thoughts on this, I have used the MSI 1080 Ti for over a month. Now, is a 1080 Ti a 4K card? Looking at the frame rates here, I would have to say maybe. In all cases, apart from Mass Effect Andromeda, the card was able to maintain 60 frames per second, which is of course the first magic number. But again, this is on a 144Hz monitor. If you're running a 4K monitor, chances are it's maybe only 60Hz, and I do feel that you're going to notice the lower frame rate at only 60Hz. So I'm still going to maintain my position that the 1080 Ti is a 1440p card, and at that resolution, it is a truly fantastic graphics card, with the worst result today being 84.3 frames per second in Rise of the Tomb Raider. That is pretty smooth experience. For me, 90 is my own magic number, at which point I really can't feel a huge difference above that, and the 1080 Ti basically achieves that in almost every case. So the real question here is it worth the money? Now, I'm pretty critical of Nvidia's pricing, but that is mostly aimed at the mid-range graphics cards, for example your GTX 1080. Over these past few years, Nvidia has increased the prices of the mid-range dramatically. In fact, they have more than doubled at the mid-range. This hasn't really been the case at the high end though. And if you go back to say 2013, we can see the launch price here of the GTX 780, $650, and a bit later on you can see the 780 Ti had a launch price of $700. And then you move on to the 980 Ti with a launch price of $650, and the 1080 Ti launched at $699. So there's not been that massive increase in pricing at the high end, which is what the GTX 1080 Ti is. Now looking over at Newegg, the price of MSI's 1080 Ti Gaming X is $760, but for that you're getting an excellent cooling system and what looks to be a high quality GPU, one which should overclock well, while showing good power consumption as well. Looking at the 1080 Ti Gaming X's competitor today, the RX Vega Liquid Edition, and prices are $800. And given the 32.2% lead in performance for the 1080 Ti Gaming X, it does not require a genius to figure out which one of these cards is the better value. Taking a look at the other possible competition, the GTX 1080. The 1080 is going to perform almost identically to the Liquid Edition Vega you saw here today, and prices are around $580. There's one or two you can get a bit cheaper here, closer to the $500 mark, but the fact here is the Ti is going to be 35% faster, while costing you around 40% more. It goes back to what I said about the mid-range cards not being very good value. Even at around $500, I consider the GTX 1080 to be a poor buy. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the Titan XP, which they don't even have on Newegg, but how much is that one? $1,200? Obviously that is a complete waste of money. And that just leads me perfectly to the conclusion, because the way the graphics market is today, with Nvidia being utterly dominant and with crypto coin miners pushing up prices, there are in fact very few cards that are even worth considering, and all of them are Nvidia cards. And at the high end, the true high end, there is only one video card even worth considering, and that quite simply is the 1080 Ti. It thrashes Vega while being cheaper, more power efficient while remaining cool and quiet. And for me, MSI's 1080 Ti is a fantastic card, and there is absolutely no reason not to consider this one as your choice. So there you have it. MSI claimed that this was the ultimate gaming graphics card, and in my opinion, they are probably just about right. And before you ask, no, I don't get to keep it. In fact, I'll be heading back to MSI very soon, and I'll be sorry to see it go. If you're interested in buying one, check out the description below for links to Amazon. But that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you later, guys.